A Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing focused on one of the most important questions facing the global economy: how and when the Strait of Hormuz might reopen. Senator Chris Murphy pressed Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the administration's strategy, warning that the closure of one of the world's most important shipping routes is creating enormous pressure on consumers, energy markets, and international trade. Watch the exchange first, then we'll break down the competing arguments, the administration's negotiating position, and why the outcome could have major consequences far beyond the Middle East.
Today, despite the differences that existed between Republicans and Democrats prior to this administration on how to approach Iran's nuclear program, the theory was basically the same, that we were going to impose significant harm on the Iranian economy in order to force them to the table to negotiate. What is happening now is fundamentally different. This war and the administration's decision to blockade has now held the entire world economy and the U.S. economy hostage to the ability to negotiate an agreement with Iran. This is why the entire country is seized by the question of when there will be an agreement, because apparently until there is an agreement, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. There is a cost to the Iranian economy, but now there is a devastating cost to the U.S. economy. It has been indecipherable, the information coming from the administration, especially in the past several weeks, as we get signals that a deal is imminent. The president said yesterday he's bored by the negotiations. He doesn't care whether we get a deal. I think it's really important for us to understand what your bottom lines are, what you're asking for in this negotiation, what commitments you need Iran to make in order for you to release the blockade, and we hope for them to release the blockade as well. So give us a little insight into what your bottom lines are, what is going to get the strait reopened, because this is kind of the only question that matters for American consumers right now. And every day we get wildly different signals from the president as to whether he even is engaged in this question as to whether the strait is going to reopen.
Yeah, I think your question gets right to the heart of the matter. So I think it's a good question. Let me first bifurcate two things. The only reason there's a blockade, the only reason why there's a U.S. blockade is because Iran has closed they're firing on commercial ships, and they've mined large segments of Hormuz, international waters. And so the blockade is only against Iranian ships. And it's very simple. The notion is if no one's ships are going to get out, then Iran's ships aren't going to get out either. We can't live in a world in which they get to close the straits and tell everybody, pay us a toll or we'll blow you up, but their ships get to go out unfettered. So that's the reason why there's a blockade. There wouldn't have been a blockade if Iran had agreed to do what they said they would do when the ceasefire kicked in, which is they were going to open the straits. So let me just focus on the straits for a moment. Number one, what they're doing is unlawful and illegal. There isn't a country on earth, other than Iran, and maybe Oman that flirted with it, who's in favor of what Iran is doing in the straits. The Chinese are against it. The Russians are against it. Everyone is against it. The whole world is against it. So condition number one is they have to reopen the straits. And reopening the straits means the following. Ships can sail through international waters the way they can do through other choke points around the world without being fired upon, without paying a toll. That's condition number one.
But the strait is closed because of our decision to invade Iran. This is a consequence of our military action. So I guess I'm not interested in litigating that question. We all know why the strait is closed, because you took military action against Iran, and we knew ahead of time that that would be their likely response. The question is, how are we going to get it reopened? Are you going to drive a bargain that is so tough and so hard that the strait remains closed? So how are we going to get it open?
The first thing, that is a predicate to anything else happening. The straits have to be reopened. So the way to think about it is this. If Iran wants to be able to move its oil again through the strait, they will have to reopen the straits. If they refuse to do so, then we have other options available to us, but we would prefer to negotiate the opening of this, which means
tell us about the negotiations. What do you need from them in order to get the strait reopened? We need the strait reopened tomorrow.
Well, what needs to happen is very simple. They need to announce that they will no longer fire on commercial ships that are going through, or threaten to fire on ships, because in many cases, ships just won't move. They won't go, not because they got fired on, but because of the risk of being fired upon. And so they have to announce very clearly, the straits are now open. We're not charging a toll. We will help remove the mines that they put in there. and they will not fire on ships.
But the president says they also need to make commitments on their nuclear program. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
What commitments do they need to make in order for the Strait to be reopened?
Well, the second thing they have to agree to as part of this is, so in addition to the Straits, that's the predicate that opens the door to phase two. Phase two is they have to commit to very specific negotiations on highly enriched, the disposition of the highly enriched uranium that still is buried deep in a mountain somewhere. They have to agree on negotiating severe and long-term limitations and or cancellation of enrichment activity in their country.
In the second phase of negotiations.
Well, obviously these are highly technical matters, so I don't think you could work those out in 5 days. That would require a team of experts to meet over a 30, 60, 90-day period and work out the details. But they have to commit to their willingness to do that. For example, they have to commit to say, we will dispose of the enriched uranium, and the question now is, what are the mechanisms by which we do so? That can be negotiated.
Final question. In order to get to that second phase, are you willing to release sanctions or release frozen money that the United States is withholding from Iran?
Right now, everything that's been discussed with them is that any sanctions relief, now remember, sanctions come, there's international sanctions, there's congressional sanctions, there's executive sanctions, so some we can release and some we cannot. But any sanctions relief is condition-based, which means it has to be in return for the reason why those sanctions were put in place in the first place, which is their nuclear program. So yeah, look, Iran is being sanctioned because they enrich uranium. Iran is being sanctioned because they've highly enriched uranium. Iran is being sanctioned because of their nuclear activities. If they agree to give up those things, there will be sanctions relief associated with their commitment and compliance with those agreements.
You will not give sanctions relief just in exchange for reopening the Strait?
No, that's not been discussed. That's not been offered.
What made this exchange particularly significant was that it highlighted a fundamental disagreement not just about Iran, but about the relationship between military action, economic pressure, diplomacy, and global stability. At first glance, the hearing appeared to be a discussion about the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. But in reality, the debate was much broader. Senator Chris Murphy and Secretary Marco Rubio were discussing two competing theories of how to deal with Iran and how to end a crisis that has implications for energy markets, inflation, international trade, and global security. Murphy's central concern was economic. His argument was that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has consequences far beyond Iran. While sanctions and economic pressure have long been used to influence Iranian behavior, Murphy argued that the current situation places substantial costs on the global economy as well. In his view, the administration's military actions and subsequent events created a situation where not only Iran but also consumers, businesses, and governments around the world are now affected by the disruption of maritime trade. The significance of the Strait of Hormuz cannot be overstated. For decades, it has been one of the most strategically important waterways in the world. A substantial percentage of globally traded oil and liquefied natural gas passes through this narrow corridor. Any disruption immediately attracts the attention of governments, investors, shipping companies, and financial markets. This is why Murphy repeatedly returned to a simple question. How does the administration intend to reopen the strait? That question matters because every day the strait remains closed or restricted can affect shipping costs, insurance costs, energy prices, and ultimately consumer prices around the world. Rubio approached the issue from a different perspective. Rather than focusing primarily on the consequences of the blockade, he focused on what he viewed as the underlying cause. His argument was that Iran created the crisis by threatening commercial shipping, mining international waters, and interfering with freedom of navigation. According to Rubio, the administration's actions were a response rather than the origin of the problem. This distinction is important because it shapes how each side evaluates possible solutions. If one believes the primary issue is economic disruption, then the focus naturally becomes reopening the waterway as quickly as possible. If one believes the primary issue is Iranian behavior, then reopening the waterway becomes linked to changing that behavior. Those two approaches can lead to very different negotiating strategies. One of the most revealing moments came when Murphy attempted to move beyond assigning blame and focus on outcomes. Several times during the hearing, he essentially said that everyone already knows why the strait is closed and that the more urgent question is what happens next. That is a common theme in foreign policy debates. There is often disagreement over how a crisis began, but policymakers eventually must decide how the crisis ends. Murphy was pressing for specifics about the administration's endgame. Rubio's answer provided a rare glimpse into the administration's negotiating framework. He described what appeared to be a two-phase approach. The first phase focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz and restoring freedom of navigation. According to Rubio, this would require clear commitments from Iran to stop threatening commercial shipping, stop demanding payments for passage, and ensure safe transit through international waters. Only after those conditions are met would negotiations move into a second phase. The second phase involves Iran's nuclear program. This is where the hearing became especially important. Rubio suggested that future discussions would focus on highly enriched uranium, enrichment activities, and long-term restrictions related to Iran's nuclear capabilities. In essence, the administration appears to be linking maritime security and nuclear diplomacy into a broader negotiating framework. That approach has both potential advantages and potential risks. Supporters might argue that combining these issues increases leverage and creates incentives for meaningful concessions. Critics might argue that linking multiple complex issues together makes negotiations more difficult and increases the chances of deadlock. The hearing also highlighted the challenge of translating broad policy goals into practical agreements. It is one thing to say that a waterway should reopen. It is another thing to determine exactly what commitments, inspections, guarantees, and enforcement mechanisms are necessary to make that happen. Similarly, it is one thing to say that nuclear restrictions are necessary. It is another thing to negotiate detailed technical arrangements that satisfy both sides. Rubio acknowledged this reality when he described the highly technical nature of nuclear negotiations. His comments suggested that even if broad principles are agreed upon, implementing those principles would likely require extensive negotiations involving experts, inspectors, diplomats, and technical specialists. Another notable part of the exchange involved sanctions. Murphy wanted to know whether sanctions relief might be offered in exchange for reopening the strait. This question goes directly to the heart of international diplomacy. Sanctions are often used as leverage. The key question is what governments receive in return for easing those sanctions. Rubio's response was significant because he drew a distinction between reopening the strait and addressing nuclear concerns. He indicated that sanctions relief would be tied to nuclear commitments rather than simply to maritime access. That answer suggests the administration is attempting to preserve leverage during negotiations rather than offering immediate concessions. Whether that strategy succeeds depends on factors that remain uncertain. Diplomatic negotiations often involve balancing pressure and incentives. Too much pressure can make compromise difficult. Too many concessions can reduce leverage. Finding the right balance is one of the most challenging aspects of international diplomacy. The hearing also underscored how foreign policy decisions can quickly become domestic economic issues. For many Americans, discussions about shipping lanes in the Middle East may seem distant. Yet disruptions in global energy markets can affect gasoline prices, transportation costs, inflation, and household budgets. Murphy repeatedly emphasized this connection. His argument was that the consequences are no longer confined to the region itself. They are being felt by consumers and businesses far beyond the Middle East. That is one reason the exchange attracted attention. It connected international security decisions to everyday economic concerns. Perhaps the most important takeaway from the hearing was that both sides appeared to agree on the ultimate objective. Neither Murphy nor Rubio argued that the strait should remain closed. Neither argued against preventing nuclear proliferation. Neither argued against restoring stability. The disagreement centered on strategy. Murphy focused on urgency and economic costs. Rubio focused on leverage and security guarantees. Both perspectives reflect legitimate concerns that policymakers must balance. By the end of the exchange, viewers learned more about what the administration wants than how it plans to achieve it. The hearing provided a clearer picture of the conditions the administration believes are necessary for progress. However, many practical questions remain unanswered. How quickly could negotiations begin? How long might they last? What verification mechanisms would be required? How would compliance be measured? What role would allies play? What happens if talks fail? Those questions remain unresolved. But the hearing succeeded in clarifying something important. The administration views the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and the future of Iran's nuclear program as interconnected challenges rather than separate issues. Whether that strategy produces a breakthrough or prolongs the standoff remains to be seen. What is clear is that the stakes extend far beyond a single waterway. They involve global commerce, regional security, energy markets, diplomatic credibility, and the broader balance between pressure and negotiation in international affairs. That is why this exchange mattered and why the outcome of these negotiations could have consequences felt well beyond Washington, Tehran, or the Persian Gulf.